Welcome everyone to the Cybersecurity breakout session of the Pennsylvania Autonomous Vehicle Summit. My name is Courtney Ehrlichman and I will be moderating today's event. I am the head of strategy at Panasonic's Next Lab, and I'm based in Pennsylvania, and I've previously worked at Carnegie Mellon's Traffic 21 Institute and with Pennsylvania's Autonomous Vehicle Task Force. Just a few housekeeping items before we get to our fantastic lineup of speakers. Just so you're all aware, this session is going to be recorded and will be available to you and other attendees later on this year. You're also all muted, and you will be automatically muted the whole time to reduce any background noise. Please feel free to use the chat function for general conversation and comments, but I do need you to use the Q&A section for questions for the panelists. There's a really neat function in there where we can upvote questions as well to make sure that the faves get asked at the end. So please do play with that and put your questions there. There will be, again, a panel discussion at the end where we'll go through those Q&As, and hopefully we will not miss any of them. So without further ado, our first presenter today is Bradley Potteiger. He is Johns Hopkins University's embedded exploitation researcher. Full bios for all of today's speakers are available in the Summit program and on the Summit website. But with that, I'll let Bradley do an intro and present.
Thanks, Courtney. Hey everybody, I'm Brad Potteiger, senior researcher at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. And so today I wanted to kind of get this breakout session started by talking a little bit about the offensive side of things, looking at, what are the threats that are emerging in the autonomous vehicle landscape and how can we go and protect against them. So quick bio about me, did my PhD at Vanderbilt University, focusing a lot on autonomous vehicle security and resilience. And also spent a lot of time within the government as well, at the National Security Agency and the White House. Right now, in the last couple of years, I've been at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, working a lot on embedded exploitation, assurance of autonomous systems, and also serving on the side as a visiting assistant professor at UMBC and on the academic council for PAVE. So really a lot of times when I, do these talks, one of the first things people ask is, okay, we're doing cyber warfare. How do you hack a country, right? And so generally cyber attacks are pretty infrequent in terms of case studies as far as the nation state level. But we can also look at kind of crisis that we've seen in the past to kind of influence how is a cyber attack going to look like when it actually happens from a nation state against us. And so if you guys remember the past couple of years, we've seen cases of mass urban congestion, such as the snowstorm in Atlanta, which basically caused gridlock throughout the city. We've seen shipping disasters, such as the current one that's going on with the supply chain that is potentially going to cause delays in Christmas presents arriving. And we've also seen fuel spike happen throughout our country. So looking at ransomware attacks, looking at the Colonial Pipeline attack, basically seeing the chaos that these things cause in our society. Now, these things were often isolated in terms of the section of the country that they've happened. So now just picture this. Picture instead of these attacks happening in cases such as the Colonial Pipeline on the East Coast, Atlanta, the state of Georgia, these happen against all of our country. So the chaos that happened from these crises is now 100-fold, 1,000-fold, and this is really what does damage to our country. And so when we look at the current state of the cyber warfare landscape, this is the reality. Traditionally, people think of anonymous and hacktivist groups as their biggest threats. Nowadays, it's actually the nation state level. So traditionally, people thought countries like China, North Korea, and Russia and Iran were going to attack and focus their efforts just on the big government agencies. So the White House, the NSA, the CIA, places like that. However, they're starting to delve into this concept called chaos theory, where instead of focusing all of their efforts on the hard target, they're trying to scale on the soft targets. So they're looking at these ransomware attacks against banks and hospitals, and they're also looking at the transportation sector as an avenue to cause this mass chaos throughout our society. So when this happens, when these nation states come for you, who are you going to call? Right? It's not going to be the Ghostbusters. It's not going to be your local PD. When these attacks happen, it takes all of the resources of these big intelligence community agencies, such as the FBI, the NSA, the DHS, DISA, to bring the highest regarded talent, the most sophisticated tools and expertise to the table in order to respond rapidly and effectively to get all of these nation state actors out of our critical infrastructure. When we look at autonomous vehicles, they're classified as a concept called cyber physical systems. And so traditionally, when you think about traditional IT systems, you think of credit card databases, you think of, employee records, healthcare records, things like that. Cyber physical systems are when you combine the embedded computational functionality with some type of sensor and actuation physical process. So when we think of vehicles, they're traditionally standalone legacy systems. So they've been around for decades, and they're traditionally mechanical systems that are designed not to have interconnectivity within the external remote interfaces. However, now when they're starting to get more and more connected to other vehicles, vehicle to infrastructure communication interfaces, and even the public internet, all of these legacy software applications that were built decades ago have these vulnerabilities such as buffer overflow, memory corruption attacks, weird machines that traditionally weren't designed to be factored in the defense and def approach. However, now when they're accessible remotely from not only our country, but halfway across the world, these nation state actors can access these vulnerabilities and use them to remotely exploit these vehicle systems. So when we compare them to modern applications such as Facebook, Google, Slack, right, those web applications are actually, in a sense, more secure than the vehicles we have on our roads today, which is scary to think about. So from a personal perspective, one of the things that I think about when I look at the biggest threats to connected vehicles are three things: the software supply chain, AI algorithms, and communication infrastructure. So similar to the SolarWinds attack, everybody saw how different Trojans connected it strategically within the supply chain could scale to all of these different customers throughout our country, even big government agencies. Now, when we look at the vehicle landscape, we think of homogeneous software. So every version of BMW has the same software. Every version of Mercedes has the same software. If someone can find a vulnerability of one of these cars, they can scale it to every single person, not only in our country, but around the world. The other component we need to look at is the dependencies. So looking at, when you use different libraries like TensorFlow and machine learning libraries, right? We didn't write those. Like the companies didn't write those. You have to have that certain aspect of trust in place to know that they don't have any vulnerabilities in their code. Now with SolarWinds, what we saw is when you implicitly trust somebody and they are attacked, that's the single point of failure for your vehicles and for your enterprise. So we need to make sure, we need to figure out how do we protect against these trust issues. In terms of AI algorithms, everybody knows about adversarial machine learning, how we can change, stop signs to be speed limit signs and things like that. But one of the interesting, relevant research topics is Trojans, injecting these edge cases into the models so that we can directly cause a car to drive off the road or crash or things like that. And then finally, communication infrastructure. When 5G is starting to become more apparent in our society, right, there's a big race now to see who is going to build the backbone for it, who is going to provide the infrastructure in our company. And with that infrastructure comes access to a huge amount of data that, if put in the wrong hands, can have privacy violations. People can establish pattern of life. People can start predicting who someone's going to talk to and things like that, that can basically be huge privacy violations for modern US citizens. I just want to kind of quickly go over two case studies demonstrating these. The first one is Ruckus. So looking at the software supply problem, right, there's a lot of figures here, but really what I want to point out is the goal of what we had in terms of created automated reverse engineering vulnerability discovery application. And with that, we tried to take the low-hanging fruit from supply chain vulnerabilities, as well as the similarity between different software applications, to focus most of our time on finding the low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities and applications. Once we found this low-hanging fruit, we leveraged correlation to exploit tons of other applications with similar properties around the world. And so with this, we use two device classes. We use automobiles as the proprietary software avenue, and we use routers, which have open source components that you can download directly from the internet. What we found was actually pretty interesting. We found that there is over a 50 to 60% correlation between the open source software from the routers and the proprietary software from the automobiles, which implies that security through obscurity doesn't actually work anymore. If someone blindly took router firmware and found vulnerabilities in them and blindly tried to exploit and deploy that against the automobiles, there's a significant likelihood that they actually could be successful with those attacks, right? Which implies that we need to figure out a next step to prevent against them. The next avenue we looked at was AI Trojans. And so, like I said before, traditionally most researchers focus on adversarial machine learning. However, similar to SolarWinds, if someone can directly inject a Trojan into the supply chain, for example, they can have a stealth capability and backdoor in place so that they can basically hack someone and exfiltrate data without the other person knowing. With these Trojans, what we're able to do is demonstrate that after training a model, we could inject a Trojan in place to cause edge cases to happen that could cause a car to drive off the road, given certain scenarios. Now, from the attacker side, what this tells us is all we need to do is know what we need to do to trigger that in terms of this scenario and in terms of the physical situation. By doing that, we basically know how to stealthily attack our adversaries without them knowing about that. It's also interesting, we were 90% successful in this. So this is something that is pretty effective in terms of having stealth capabilities against, autonomous vehicles. But also, again, vulnerabilities in the machine learning libraries were a big factor as well to consider. So looking at how are we going to protect against these in the next phase of our autonomous vehicle development, we need to focus on three things. To address the supply chain, we need to focus on zero trust architectures. We need to assume that everything we get, we can't trust, right? Everything we get is compromised, and we need to work from there. So all of the software we get from our repositories or libraries, we need to validate that maintains integrity. The other thing we need to look at is how do we decrease the probability of someone being able to attack us with a generic exploit concept, right? Similar to what we did with Ruckus, we don't want Russia, China, North Korea to just find one vulnerability and scale it to millions of people. So I'm a big proponent of a concept called software diversity or moving target defense to essentially change the landscape of our attack surface so that if someone can find one vulnerability in some person's application, they can't use that against us. They can only use it against that one person. So basically, this mitigates the risk and it provides a degree of resilience in place to make sure that people can't scale these attacks, such as what we did. The next category is AI assurance. We need to focus on building confidence in our algorithms and assuring that our algorithms always maintain integrity and safety. And finally, we need to focus on the external communication infrastructure. I believe everybody knows what company I refer to when I say we need to focus on not using foreign companies for our 5G backbone and our smart city backbones. We need to focus on exclusively domestic infrastructure because at the national security landscape, all these countries, they're in a race right now to get as many countries to implement their backbones into them so that when the time comes and all this data becomes available on them, they're going to have a huge amount of access to do all these analytics, all these pattern of life privacy violations that they can use for their national interests. For our case, we need to focus exclusively domestic to make sure that our national security is maintained as intact and we can ensure that we can keep everything in-house in terms of trusting our infrastructure, making sure that there's no backdoors, no Trojans or anything, and making sure that we can have a prosperity against other countries. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Courtney for the rest of the presenters.
Thanks, Brad. That was great. I think the answer to who are you going to call when there's a breach is Brad. And really liked your research perspective. Amazing work there. So security from a work, and how are we going to protect ourselves from these vulnerabilities? And I'm hoping in the panel discussion we can talk beyond the country level to perhaps how we can protect ourselves internally, beyond, from internal attacks. But with that, I would like to turn over the mic to Jeff Davis, Blackberry Senior Director of the IVY ecosystem, so we can learn more about products in the marketplace that are being developed to protect us against vulnerabilities.
Everyone, just give me a second while I try to share my screen here. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Davis. I am the Senior Director for Business Development for the IVY ecosystem. And I've been at Blackberry for about 3 years. And prior to that was at ITS America. And I think I see a few familiar names in the inside this breakout session that I know from that world. But prior to that, I spent about 26 years in national security, which is how somebody like me comes to end up talking about cybersecurity. And so I will say that I will not be anywhere near as thorough as Brad is, nor as specific as Anuja will be afterwards. But I think what I can do is I can take a lot of what Brad's saying and do a translation into what's happening in the marketplace right now, where we are, and really the challenges that we face, what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. So it's a fairly quick presentation, but I'll go ahead and get it started. So I want to start out with what I see as grand myths. And I call them grand myths because I think they're things that we tend to tell ourselves or we tend to see. And this does not just happen within the transportation industry. This has happened with just about every industry that's had to face cybersecurity. So it's a few things to really look at and to look at where our biases sit right now. And I start with the transportation industry is not really under threat. And I think, a couple of things that Brad was talking about in the last one, we've already seen ransomware, there's incidents of ransomware putting, shutting down the largest shipping company in the world for a matter of about almost 30 days. Right now you're currently starting to see probing happening across, as Brad was talking about, people putting Trojans into the system, looking for vulnerable systems and finding and just sitting dormant in those systems until something of value starts to come into them. And then, in the future, you look at what's really happening, what's going to draw people into this, it's motivations, payments, the supply chain, and the safety aspects of it really become major issues looking into the future. So the way I like to look at that is the fact that we don't feel that we're as under threat as we actually are is the most dangerous threat that we have. The next one is, people look at the idea of air gapping a problem. You hear about this a lot in the auto industry, where we think that we can go ahead and just keep certain systems that we want to maintain safety on and just keep them safe. The problem with that is, one, as we've seen in other industries and in other places, that just doesn't work. You don't get the benefits of the technology that you're using if you're shutting down pieces of the technology. And you can see that first bullet that I have up there, ECU consolidation, so electronic control units within automobiles. what we're seeing is the automobiles as they become more and more advanced, we don't get more and more electronic control units, we get fewer and fewer. We get more and more done on more and more powerful chips. And what that does is that starts creating a wider surface. The next one is, the proliferation of IoT. It's not just the connections that are in the car, but the connections that are happening across the transportation infrastructure. When you look at all of these, every single one of those is a threat vector, and every single one of those creates a vulnerability. And we could do things like cut them off, but the wiser answer is to actually look at this in more of a zero trust environment, as Brad was talking about prior to this. And then the other thing that really makes air gapping kind of an impossibility is that technology tends to democratize over time. It doesn't become more controlled. The most control happens when a technology first comes about, and then over time it will democratize. So even if we successfully do this in a manufacturing sense, or you successfully air gap, a new technology will come in that could inevitably hurt that air gap, could inevitably compromise that air gap. And the other side is that people feel that we're doing enough. This is the idea that, well, we went ahead and we got a CISO, and so we're all set now. He's got the problem under control. I want to start out by saying this, that first of all, it's one of the two industries that are out there that's at 0% unemployment for these industries. It's almost impossible to hire a good CISO without spending quite a bit of money. Cybersecurity is a very sought after trade. And so just saying I have a CISO is not enough. Just saying I have put a plan in place is not really going to be enough. These are criminal and state threats. As Bradley kind of pointed out before, it's not something that you can that you're doing battle with somebody sitting on their grandmother's couch, like, the popular idea behind this whole thing. You're dealing with criminal enterprises and state enterprises. And they're putting their best trained minds behind this. So what is enough is never really enough. The idea that we can engineer our way out of this problem is not realistic. And the reason is that you have acting, thinking, intelligent people working against you. So the moment you build something, you are the one who's at a disadvantage. The moment a product hits the floor, and the moment that it comes out and it's out there available to the open public, those people are working against that. They're trying to figure out how to break that product. This is not a matter of just being able to put something through a rigor and saying, oh, well, it passed the rigors and it can move on. And so we know if it works within these conditions, then it will continue to work safely, because our adversaries are trying to change those conditions consistently. So, and again, they have the advantage on it. And the other side is vulnerabilities grow throughout time. There will never be enough to do. It continues to get harder and harder. That's why you get annoying updates on your phone and with Microsoft consistently, is because a new vulnerability is found in that. The longer that a product sits out there, especially a software product, the longer it sits out there, the longer there's been a criminal or state actor trying to find the vulnerabilities within that. And then I put in big capital letters here, supply chain. And Bradley mentioned it, and I want to hit on it again and talk about why it's such a big deal. And just to give a really quick scenario on this. So as I said, I worked in national defense for 26 years. I was a Marine officer for 21 of those, and the other 5 years I spent working on the commercial side. And what I can tell you is that when you look at how hard it is, how difficult it is for the United States military, for the Department of Defense, to actually maintain control over the supply chains that are going all the way up to missiles. The challenges that they have in trying to stop insider threats and in trying to prevent somebody somewhere in that supply chain corrupting that product or corrupting that code, it's enormously difficult. So there's immense amounts of money that go into that alone. There are actually AI algorithms working around the clock within DoD trying to find actions and behaviors of insiders and insider threats. I do not know a civilian company that actually puts that type of rigor into their supply chains. And I'm not proposing that we have to put that kind of rigor in, but if I can go back to something Bradley said before, the idea of soft targets. And for those not familiar with that type of vernacular, all that means is if I see a door and there's two 6-foot, 230-pound guys with bulging muscles standing in front of that door, and I want to get on the other side of it, it's probably not going to be successful if I just try to butt my head up against that door. But if I walk around the house and I find a side door or an open window, I'm going to try to go in that way. And that's what you're looking at with a soft target. Our adversaries are constantly looking for an easy target. And quite honestly, the transportation industry writ large, whether that's automotive or you take it to the cities, the states, across the board, this is an underfunded place, and it's a challenge, and it really needs quite a bit of attention. So going on to the next part, and I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into ECUs and electrification as kind of like a case study as to not only why we're not doing enough, but why it's so difficult to do something like air gap when you talk about cybersecurity or just engineer your way across it, and why it's such a hard thing. And I want to excuse the diagrams that are on here. They're ones I took off the internet because they're the only things I could find that weren't proprietary to a particular company or organization. They were kind of sitting out open source, which is why I use them. But so they're not overly depictive of the issue or the situation, but I wanted to be fair to all of our partners and customers and not spread their information. So basically, when you look across electronic control units currently, right, your current place where we are, it does allow for some air gap, and although things do come together at the can, there is quite a bit of air gapping that can take place with safety systems and things along those lines. You can't start to bifurcate those things. But as time goes on, the problem is this provides limited compute power the way things are. And to get the kind of compute power that we want to get for autonomous vehicles, for the types of features that we want to have inside vehicles, for the things we want to be able to do inside vehicles, for the things that I hear, conference after conference about the future of mobility, that takes quite a bit of computing power. And that doesn't really sit with the way that the current architecture is set. So when you and if you want evidence of this, think of anybody who's gone to see a autonomous vehicle demonstration. If you notice, most of these automobiles will have sitting in the trunk a server of some kind, because something has to work that massive amount of compute that it takes to run an autonomous vehicle. You can't do it on the current architecture of the car. So the ECUs are consolidating. They're consolidating not just for autonomous vehicles, but because of things like electrification, which, although an extremely simple engine, has a whole lot of complexities in how the car runs, and a whole lot of issues that come up with battery power, battery life, how long you can actually keep that vehicle running on the road, and when and how you recharge. So ECUs are consolidating. Again, this goes to the greater compute power. It allows for all those advanced capabilities that we were talking about, but it does make air gapping extremely difficult, because now you're talking about working several systems possibly on the same chip. And if you want to have functionality that comes with communication, then you might, if you try to air gap these things, you're going to lose functionality that comes with ADAS or with autonomous vehicles or anything along those lines. So this creates a larger attack surface. I know it sounds crazy, fewer ECUs, but larger attack surface, because I've now got a single surface I can go into and look for multiple ways to break into it. And once I get in there, I have multiple things I can go to. So again, causes a great deal of challenge. And then the next thing I want to hit on is electrification in the grid, and that's kind of tie this whole idea of automotive and infrastructure together. And I bring this up. Connected vehicles are obviously reality as it sits right now. We have vehicles connected through LTE. We will have them connected through 5G. I won't even discuss anything that has to do with V2X, but what I will say with it is that electrification in the grid is another spot where you're looking at automobiles connecting into a grid. So that there are signals being sent through that automobile, to that automobile, and from that automobile when they connect into a charging station. And as they connect into that charging station, those signals are in turn, sending signals out to the greater grid. So there's vulnerabilities in there. And again, when you start talking about a soft target, if I'm a country, an adversarial country, and I want to shut down transportation in the United States, an easy way to do it, especially as we start to electrify, is shut down those electric grids. If I want to shut down a country and I want to create an enormous problem for them strategically, shut down their electric grid and send them into send them back into the 18th century. That's why this is part of a challenge. And that's why, one, it's never something it's not a problem that'll be solved. This is a discussion that will go on forever, because as these changes come, more changes will come. But there are things that we are doing right. So I do want to point that out, right? We are merging technology and transportation, right? So, and what I mean by that is we're merging technology companies with automobile companies. We're merging them, and I don't mean in the business sense of the word merging, but we are bringing them together. We're starting to see a lot more automotive companies outsourcing some of their more technological problems. They're looking towards software companies to build out a lot of the challenges that they have for a few reasons. Some of it is just plain practical. If Google or Apple is building out CarPlay systems and Google Play systems, then you're less reliant on the IVI internal to the car, and they can use that compute power someplace else. But in turn, you also have those updates are being done by these other companies. So when I put 25 years of updates on there, that is typical for a software company to be planning to do updates for up to 25 years. That is not something that is typical for most automotive companies. That is not something that sits in their budgetary planning whatsoever. So that's a big change. And so that's a good thing that we're doing, though, because we're taking companies that are doing those jobs and allowing them to go forward. And I think I got just a little bit more time left, so I'm going to hurry up here. But the other thing that I'd say we're doing very well is things like the Auto ISAC and PAVE. Talking about these things, getting it out here, getting people like Brad into this community and getting them talking about it is extremely important, because we don't have the know-how internal to this community, and we need to really bring that in. And then I'll just go ahead and hit on this last one, securing across the enterprise. Again, as Brad said, it's not enough to just build a secure car. You have to build it across the supply chain, and you have to build it all the way up through every part of the infrastructure of a company. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn this back over to Courtney as well, and stand by for any questions that may come up.
Thank you, Jeff. Folks in the audience, please remember to post your questions in the Q&A. It's looking lonely over there. So just make sure you're plugging them in. And if you have any questions about that, you can drop that in the chat. But Q&As go in the Q&A section. Our last presenter is and she is SteerTech's founder and CEO. Anuja, please take some time to introduce yourself, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Anuja Sonalker, and I'm the CEO of Steer. and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So I'm going to have a slide help where I'm going to ask for my next slide. Before we begin, I'd just like to share a little bit about myself. I got my PhD in distributed system security way back when in 2005, and predominantly focused on building resilient, wireless, moving ad hoc network communicating nodes. And that lent itself very nicely to automobile sensors and systems and building resilient systems. I've had the honor and the privilege of being among some of the recognized people in this industry, and it's been wonderful. I also lead some standards activities, so I focus on really spreading the word out about cybersecurity and creating a consensus among groups to what the right approach to security should be. There is a standard called ISO 21434, which is on-road vehicle cybersecurity that just launched this year, 5 years in the making, and 13 countries are signatory to the standard, and it is mandatory for all vehicles on the road from 2022 onwards. So I was chair of the standard, and it was a Herculean effort to really get consensus and put it out there. I also work with the PAVE organization. I'm on the board, spreading awareness about autonomous vehicles and really educating people about what they are and mainly what they are not. And also a long association with the University of Maryland, my alma mater. If you can go to my next slide. Talk a little bit about my work here. So Steer is actually my third startup. My last two were acquired by Honeywell and Harman in the automotive space. But I come from about 2 decades of experience in building cyber physical systems, mainly for the US defense sector, and some good amount of R&D building secure survivable systems, mainly in the tactical space. Half of that work was in the tactical space, and half of it has been in the automotive industry. So I got into automotive almost a decade ago when cybersecurity wasn't a thing, but it was the next frontier that we identified, and we said, this is going to get bad very, very quickly. And part of the journey has also been educating and making people understand that it's not you, it's not me, it's not us, it's us versus them, and it could be anybody. It doesn't matter which car company you are, it doesn't matter which tier 1 you are, everybody's just as vulnerable. So it's not personalizing it, it's really about the underlying technology and how to build robust systems that are proof against cyber attacks. The adversaries have become more and more challenging. So Brad and Jeff both alluded to that, and so they set me up very nicely. I'm going to not talk about some of the basics, but I'm going to focus predominantly about hang on one second, I'm sorry. Predominantly about specific aspects of security related to operations. So can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So first, before anything else, I'll just basically talk high level about a vision for automated vehicles from a fleet perspective. The vision here is what will automated vehicles do for fleets in the future. There's a promise and a potential for enhanced safety by eliminating the driver or even assisting the driver due to any fatigue, miscalculations, and things like that. There is an enhanced safety component here. Increasing efficiency by reducing any operational downtime, using off-shift times, using duty cycles to the max, reducing the frictions that usually is associated with humans. We can create more efficient operations. Cost is another factor. Fuel efficiency, achieving great fuel efficiency, streamlined operations can result in lower costs. And also asset management. So a lot of these technologies, because of the way AVs are built, there is so much control over what the vehicles are doing, where they are, what they are doing, seeing, operating, etc. So you have much more better asset management. So it actually allows you, depending on the systems, how they're built, it allows you to do sometimes remote diagnostics, sometimes it allows to remote control vehicles, etc. So all of that combined creates a very efficient future transportation network for use by organizations. Can I go to the next slide, please? Yeah. And there are lots of companies out there, many companies building various kinds of applications for fleets. You will not see somebody out there that says we will do a level 5, fully autonomous all the time, everywhere, anytime. So the core now is focused on getting to a level 4 automation, which is fully autonomous, but within its own specialized operational domains. And what we're seeing in the fleet space is there is a division of domains between a first and last mile operation, which is predominantly low speed. And then there's a middle mile, which is a slightly higher speeds than that. And then there is the long haul. And we find, so for example, low speed is like shuttles, autonomous shuttles, or yard depot automation, low speed operations like parking, docking, things, even steer is in the space also. So those are predominantly in private geo-fenced areas. Middle mile is like Gatik is an example of a company that functions in this space, and they do hub to hub fixed routes inner cities with mid-speed applications. And then in the long haul high speeds, we have Too Simple, Plus, Locomotion. All of these companies, they're all good friends of ours, so I don't mind sharing some of their pictures are up there as well. But these are mainly focused on longer miles, and they're predominantly doing platooning or driver assisted at this point, but a roadmap getting to a level 4 automation. So this is where the autonomous vehicle landscape Can I get to the next slide, please? Thank you. So having said that, I want to talk about fleet-based cybersecurity. Now, Brad and Jeff talked about security, and this is a subject all three of us will agree we can talk about all day. It's various different angles you can come from it, from a technology perspective, building, breaking, creating secure systems, but also from an operational perspective. So today, my talk is going to be focused on the operational aspect of fleets and how cybersecurity plays a key role here. I'll jump a little bit into technology and graze it, but I'll predominantly jump off of what Brad and Jeff have already built. So every fleet and every fleet's operation is unique to some extent because the assets are different, the administration is different, the way they interact and interface with legacy systems is different, or how their IT operations are set up and how data sharing, information flow occurs between them is different. The application area itself may be different, as I showed you on the previous slide. So because of that, every solution has to be uniquely tailored for that operation, and there is no one cookie cutter method that fits everybody. On an individual vehicle level, the cybersecurity, the attacks can be grouped into various categories at the sensor level, at the processing level, at actuation level, at telematics level, and so forth. You can club them into various levels. But when you take an individual level and you take that across a fleet, these cyber attacks get magnified. So it's not just a summation of the entities, it's actually larger. So the attack surface itself becomes much larger. It becomes more system-wide. So if you can click for me, the slide once. There you go. This is individual vehicles, and this is the individual attack surface on each of them. And that's all the different sensors, all the different actuators, everything that's on board the vehicle, telematics, etc. Your tire pressure monitoring system, your radio, your Bluetooth, all of these are porous entry points into your vehicle. You can imagine now if you have a fleet of vehicles like these, then how much that attack surface magnifies. But it's even more than that. If you go to the next slide for me, please. See, here's an example of a fleet that is being controlled and also being monitored through a cloud backend. And then you have actuating mechanisms through handheld devices that can also do monitoring or also do triggering of these vehicles. Now, the attack surface here, if you click for me, there you go. The attack surface is actually much, much bigger than the summation of the individual vehicles. It encompasses the links between these individual three components, the cloud and the fleets and the command and control centers. It encompasses all of that. And this is where really a sophisticated cyber adversary can take complete advantage. So to Jeff's point, these adversaries have gotten more and more sophisticated. They've actually arguably always been sophisticated, but the attacks have not really shown up as they have in the last 5 years. So the attacks have become very, very sophisticated. Nation states are involved. Crime syndicates are involved, and the stakes are far higher. So it's much bigger than a single vehicle, and it's predominantly focused on larger bodies of vehicles, and the targets really are the government infrastructure and critical infrastructure. So transportation actually is part of this critical infrastructure that we have to pay a lot of attention to, and is extremely vulnerable to these kind of attacks. Just ransomware, to what both my wonderful colleagues said earlier, ransomware is very, very crippling in most of the critical industries, finance and banking especially. But in transportation itself, we saw just last year, June 2020 to 2021, we've seen a 186% increase in ransomware attacks alone. So almost $170 million have been spent in fixing or giving money away to avoid these attacks. So that's a pretty steep number. And some of the examples earlier that were also given with the cargo ship that was stuck earlier this year. I think it was a steamship. And then Forward Air last year in December had a ransomware attack where their logistics network was crippled. And though they didn't pay the ransomware money, I think just shutting down their systems and clearing those attacks out and restarting their systems cost them $7.5 million in disruptions, and just getting their drivers and truck drivers back in order, and all the backlogs that created. So clearly it is a very, very sizable problem here. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about, very high level, what it would take to protect a system. What should we be thinking of? So if you have fleets that you're working with, what should you be thinking about? And this is a very high level chart. Thank you. This is a very high level chart. Again, like I said, the individual solutions are unique to your application and how you're operating. But if I can create a blanket structure, this is a standard practice: prediction, prevention, detection, and response. This is what we call a defense in-depth strategy. So you're attacking the problem at various different levels. Prediction simply means you understand where the large-scale attacks are going to come from, the large-scale attacks, and which are the most vulnerable assets and you have that should be protected, and what the debilitating effects on your operations could be, including safety. Taking a risk-based approach to ensuring adequate protection against the appropriate assets. And this is why everybody's solution, cybersecurity operation solution, will be different from others, because again, your assets will be different, your infrastructure will be different, your endpoint systems will be different. So this also includes preparation. So creating a disaster recovery plan, a cyber disaster recovery plan, and implementing robust versions of everything. So that exercise in planning, happens here. So you predict what the doomsday worst case scenario is, and there is a whole playbook that is created how to respond to this. Prevention. So prevention is always better than cure, right? So it means that, prevention simply means you're investing in resources and solutions that specifically have been built to withstand these devastating effects on your operations. So it's like disaster recovery again, but it's more robust in terms of the digital space. And Jeff and Brad both shared some solutions, very, very important. Various security mechanisms. A lot of these mechanisms are built into the technology, should be built into the technology. So security mechanisms, while the technology is being built and created, cross-validation of the data as it's being operated so that anomalies can be detected. Endpoint security, doing some secure update mechanisms. And again, secure is the key word there. Otherwise, SolarWinds, we saw that update mechanisms can also be leveraged for attacks. And having, secure architecture in your system design, right from the beginning, you're thinking about security, not as an afterthought. And then underscoring again what both Brad and Jeff said, your supply chain absolutely must be secure. And code signing, I will add code signing so that you can get to a real zero trust environment. You can actually bootstrap your trust. You can, when you have a cold start, all your systems turn on from zero, from power on mode. From that point on, you have complete trust and equivocal trust in your system. And you know that this system is operating from a point of complete trust. And then there is a chain of trust that is being maintained and proven along the way, that there is no code manipulation happening in your code, in your systems. They are not subverted. So you have proofs at every single point during operation. So it's very important to be able to do something like that. And of course, it's easier said than done. And therefore, you have to do your due diligence when you're adopting technology into your fleets. You want to make sure that you have a checklist of various things that you can actually check that these are various things that were incorporated while building the technology. Detection is the one biggest beast because it means continuous monitoring and up to date to pick up anomalous activity. This is a never ending task. This will actually always be ongoing. And an average life of an automobile is 7 years, but a commercial fleet vehicle can be anywhere between 11 to 15 years. There are some trucks operating out there for as long as 30 years, I know. But I think those trucks are more secure because they are not electronic, nothing on them. So, but that's a very important piece as well. And last but not least is response. So again, when the planning stages, you have a cyber response action plan that's ready to implement. And then when the time comes, all systems are go, that plan is implemented. There is a triage mechanism. So whatever data is coming up from the field can be very quickly addressed. We can do fault analysis, root cause tracing, and figure out where it comes from and how to stop that. So that includes sometimes maybe shutting down systems. Sometimes it uses active mitigation responses. And sometimes it's about using physics involved in the system as well. So to Jeff's point, don't think only air gapping. Air gapping is, people throw that word around a lot. And yes, air gapping can be helpful if used correctly and only in the right places where it makes sense. It does not make sense everywhere. So one thing about air gapping, just a simple thing to keep in mind is air gapping in one dimension, especially for cyber physical systems, which is what fleet vehicles, automobiles are, is air gapped in one dimension means it is not necessarily air gapped in all other dimensions. So if you have a digitally air gapped system, does not mean it is a thermodynamically air gapped system also, for example. So there have been some very high profile attacks where, that kind of a breach has been leveraged. So that, having said that, I'll go to my last slide. It's intended to be a very open-ended slide for everybody. Again, back to the picture of a fleet in operation. And if I can click once. And so now that defense in depth approach applies to all the vehicles. So at a vehicular technology level, you want to be able to apply all these primitives. At the cloud level, click one more time for me. Thank you. Also, you should be applying all these primitives because that's its own complete ecosystem. And these are two different systems that are interconnected in a very critical manner. And to Jeff's point, this is where the infrastructure backend, even EVs, AVs, all of them, the server is very important. And click one more time for me. This is where the actuation and the commands happen. So here you need the three pieces. You don't necessarily need prediction here. Prediction doesn't make sense, but you still need prevention, detection, and response here. So that's the kind of thinking you want to have here when you're operationalizing your fleets. That's how I would put it. So with that, I would like to just say thank you again, hand it over back to Courtney, and open the floor for Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Anuja. That was great. We have a few things that have popped up in the Q&A, but I have a question for everyone on the panel if they want to all hop back in, join the club. There were a lot of technical details put out there for how to protect vehicles from vulnerabilities. What can governments or people that are managing roads do in terms of ensuring that the vehicles on the roads are protected and that there's no vulnerabilities in their infrastructure?
So I can, if I can jump in further, because I think Anuja really, she hit on this, during when she talked about the ISO standard. There's really regulation and standards are probably the first step to do it, but they're only, again, you can really say it's still really only, it's just a step, right? There's still so much to do beyond that, but it's where governments can actually start. They can start educating and they can start understanding. But it really comes down to, again, you regulate first, you can write standards to it, but it comes down to vigilance in the long run.
Great,
I think also education is a big one too. You can't protect what you don't know about, right? So the partnerships between industry, academia, and government, I think, are really huge, especially to be able to bring the best talent from everywhere together to solve these problems.
Yeah, and I will add all of the above, what both of them said, but I will just say that this is a never-ending game. So you cannot expect that, okay, once done, it's done. There is a continuous component to cybersecurity. What you should do as a government and as fleet owners, what you should do is you should ask for and make sure that the technology you're buying has gone through a rigorous process of cybersecurity, looking at it from various angles, and there is documentation to show for it. Same thing with the infrastructure and the back end, but then there is the monitoring component which you will have to own. That cannot come from the technology providers because that's an in-operation situation, right? So there are emergent factors that will come out, and those can only be captured at runtime when these systems are interacting with each other. So that onus falls on the government entity.
And if I could throw one specific thing out there for where people could start is, so the cybersecurity solarium, I don't know if it really hasn't been mentioned much in this whole discussion, but they actually have been putting out a lot of guidance on a whole of government approach to dealing with cybersecurity. And I would say that that's probably another really good place to start. So going to what Brad was saying about education and going to what Anuja was saying about it being constant, it's all of that is covered as you start to look at the Cyber Solarium report and what they found and what the vulnerabilities they found. But one of the things that you can look at with it that we could definitely do better, or that governments can do better, is actually working with each other. City governments working with states working with the federal government, so on and so forth. And that's that kind of that whole of government approach to the thing, not this idea that we can solve it ourselves, because I don't know of a city or state or anybody who's managing roads that can actually solve this problem on their own. They just don't have access to the assets of it to do it.
Great, thank you for that. A lot of collaboration across industry and government is going to be necessary continuously. This is not a problem that's going to end. Just to answer the first question, everything's going to need constant updates, not just autonomous vehicles, but infrastructure and defense strategies. We've come to the end of our time. So thank you, the esteemed panelists, for your presentations and answering the questions. And thank you to the audience for participating. And thanks for being at the Pennsylvania Autonomous Vehicle Summit.